As I begin this video on the 2,300 evenings and mornings in Daniel chapter 8 verse 14 that is misinterpreted by Seventh-day Adventist and has been for over 140 years, I want to show you the verse first. Notice I have underlined there in 8:14 the word days. It says 2,300 days. You will notice two Hebrew numbers beside the word days, H6153 and H1242. Now let me show you what those words mean, or those numbers represent. Those two words are two letters, H6153 and H1242, are there for a reason, because the word day was substituted by a translator, and it should have been evenings and mornings. And you'll see more about that in a little while as well. But if you see there, the two letters, H6153 is herb, which means evening, and H1242 is bokur, meaning morning. So the correct reading then is not 2,300 days, but 2,300 evenings and mornings. The Seventh-day Adventist movement is based on one verse of Scripture that we misinterpreted, and that is Daniel 8:14. As you'll see here, it reads, "And he said unto me, 2,300 days, then the sanctuary will be cleansed." That is the verse of Scripture that is misinterpreted by every Seventh-day Adventist, and has been for 140 years, that the entire denomination is built on. It is built on a misinterpretation of Scripture. Here's what they have done. They have taken Daniel 8:14 and tried to interpret Daniel 8:14 without ever asking themselves the question that led up to Daniel 8:14. If you read Daniel 8:1 through 12, you'll see where Daniel has received these visions concerning the daily sacrifices. And he goes along there then, and in verse 13 the question is asked. "Then I said to one saint speaking, and another saint said unto the certain saint which spake, How long shall the vision be concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both to the sanctuary and to the host, and to trod under foot?" You see what they've done? They've taken Daniel 8:14 and tried to interpret it without ever asking themselves the question, or trying to answer the question that led up to it. They're asking, how long is this vision concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation going to last? The answer then was 2,300 evenings and mornings. But yet they have taken a verse of Scripture and interpreted it without ever going back and looking at the question that was asked about it. Now then, here's the thing about it. At this point, it is totally irrelevant where they go with it, because they have not asked themselves the question about the daily sacrifices. How long will this vision about the daily sacrifices be? If they had tried to answer that question, they may have gotten Daniel 8:14 right. But since they have just tried to interpret the verse without ever asking the question, understand, it is totally irrelevant where they go from now. They have misinterpreted the verse to start with. They have taken days to be years when the word years is not there. The word day there is evenings and mornings, as I've already shown you. But yet they've tried to take it and use the word day in the Hebrew language, which is yom, and force it into the text. So, as I said, it's totally irrelevant where they go from here, because they have failed to look at the question being asked in Daniel 8:13, and that is, how long will these daily sacrifices and transgressions last? And the answer was 2,300 evenings and mornings. How do I know that it was the daily sacrifice that was in question, and not the Day of Atonement as the Seventh-day Adventists try to make this verse to be. Again, if they'd gone back and looked at the entire context of this vision that was being given, verse 11, it says, it talks there about the daily sacrifice would be taken away. Verse 12, again, it talks about the daily sacrifice. Daniel is concerned about this. And then the question is asked then in verse 13, how long will this daily sacrifice, evening and morning sacrifices, be taken away? The answer was 2,300 evenings and mornings. If they'd just gone back and tried to answer the question, they never would have misinterpreted it, because they would have seen clearly that Daniel was referring to the daily sacrifices, not the year of atonement, or the day of atonement. And that's what the Seventh-day Adventists want to change this to now, the day of atonement, when it is clearly not even talking about the day of atonement to start with. It is talking about the daily sacrifices. While Daniel 8:14 may have incorrectly used the word days, again, if they'd looked at chapter 8, verse 26, they would have seen clearly again that it's the evening and mornings that is under question. Chapter 8, verse 26 says this, and the visions of the evening and morning, the same thing that was taking place in Daniel 8:14. The visions of the evening and morning. Daniel cleared it there. And the King James Version finally got it right and used the right words there, and didn't use the right word in Daniel 8:14. So it's clarified again for anyone who wants to see in verse 8:26 that he's referring to evenings and mornings and not years. Now, in an effort to salvage this misinterpretation, they go over to Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:4-6, that is talking about a day in a year, 40 days for a year. In Numbers 14:34, we all know that the people of Israel had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years because they came back from Canaan and did not follow God. They came back from spying out the promised land, and because they didn't do what God asked them to do, they were sentenced to wander in the desert for 40 years. And in Ezekiel 4:4-6, they try to take this and use it as the day-year principle. The word day, as used in Numbers and Ezekiel, is the Hebrew word yom, not Arab and bokur for evenings and mornings. Again, you can't go from a wrong interpretation and find things to straighten it out. And that's what they've tried to do. They misinterpreted Daniel 8:14 to start with, and now try to find something to support it. You can't go from a wrong interpretation and make it right unless you erase it and start all over. But that's what they have tried to do by going back to Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:4-6. They tried to find some way to justify the 2,300 days that we know now were evenings and mornings. Again, you cannot bring about a proper interpretation of anything else if you start off with the wrong interpretation to start with. And that is what the Seventh-day Adventists have done. Through a wrong interpretation of Scripture, they have came up with the wrong conclusion of Daniel chapter 8. So what we have now is from a wrong interpretation of Scripture. If you'll see on the chart that I show in several other videos, they've taken a wrong interpretation of Scripture, tried to change history and force-fit dates to do one thing. Actually, two things. One, to cover the false prophecy of Ellen White, and two, to do everything they can to slander the Catholic Church, because they could not interpret one verse of Scripture right. More in my next video. Until then, God bless.